Hi, my name is Yasmin Tarehi, and this is Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness and spirituality. Today's show is about Reiki, the ancient Japanese healing art, which has transformed the lives of many. We will explore where Reiki originated, how it's used, and where you can go to learn more. On this show, we'll be featuring our guest, Dr. Justin Stein. Justin Stein is an instructor of Asian Studies at Kwantlen Polytechnic University in British Columbia, Canada. His doctoral thesis was about the historical production of the healing practice called Reiki out of a series of mixtures of American and Japanese spiritual healing practices. He is a regular participant in the Circle of Scholars webinar on Reiki Home and has been practicing Reiki since 2001. So welcome, Justin. We're excited to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Yasmin. I appreciate the invitation.
So we have so many questions about Reiki. I think a lot of people have heard about Reiki, especially over the last couple of years. And, there's a lot of confusion as to what it is, what it means. It's obviously not an English term. And so we'd love to hear from you. What is Reiki in your terms? What's the definition? What does it mean exactly?
Okay, well, I think those are two questions. One about what is the practice and what does the word Reiki mean. But briefly, the word Reiki has been translated as universal life energy. This, I think, is a little misleading, although there is a really prevalent discourse in Reiki communities that the efficacy of the practice is based on a kind of cosmic force that permeates the universe and is accessible to all living beings and is what animates life and what provides healing. That word Reiki actually doesn't necessarily mean exactly that if you look at the Japanese, but it's difficult to say exactly what it means. You could translate it on one sense as kind of spiritual energy. I mean, that is one possible translation. But I think if you look at the historical materials, the historical context when the practice was systematized in 1920s Japan, it might be most accurate to say that it means like wonderful ki, and ki being the Japanese version of chi. So, I mean, energy is one way to translate it, but, this kind of vital force, this thing that makes us alive. But Reiki, it's more than just ki. It's this like wonderful or miraculous form of ki. And I think this informs when Reiki practitioners talk about that Reiki can, quote unquote, do no harm. I think that it's in contrast with other practices like Qigong, or maybe Kundalini yoga, where there is this kind of possibility of kind of having energy overload or something. The idea behind Reiki is that it's this kind of holy, positive kind of force, and the practice itself is primarily a hands-on healing practice in its most basic form, but there are also other dimensions of it that kind of instigate spiritual development. There are a set of precepts for kind of controlling one's emotional life and cultivating gratitude and kindness and maybe diligence that I think a lot of people have also found equally transformative as the actual hands-on healing practice. And in recent years, people have been kind of rediscovering that in early forms of the practice, there were also associated meditations with Reiki. I mean, I feel like the hands-on healing practice itself is almost like a meditation, but that there's also other more formal meditation practices also associated with it. So it's a full system. It's not just one thing. And I think that because of that, many different practitioners kind of can latch on to different aspects of the practice and find different things fulfilling, maybe at different points in their life. A lot of people talk about kind of initially being drawn to the healing aspects of it, but then later kind of realizing that all this time it's been this kind of personal development, spiritual development practice that has been working kind of subtly below the surface, is something I hear very often from practitioners.
Yeah, I think a lot of people assume that Reiki, even the folks who have actually gone to Reiki practitioners, assume that it's limited to just hands-on healing treatment. So it's interesting to see or to hear from you that there's a spectrum of ranges of what Reiki actually means. And I'd like to talk about where Reiki actually started. Where did it come from? What are the different types of schools of thought? I obviously, I think, you've referenced that it started in Japan. But I'd love to, if you can just kind of give us a brief journey of how it started. How did it come to the United States? How did it sort of move around globally?
Right. Okay. Thanks. I'll try to keep it brief, but it's a pretty complicated story. But I could go on for a long time about it. But the summarized version is the founder, a Japanese man named Usui Mikao, uh, had this kind of supernatural experience, one could say, on a sacred mountain outside of Kyoto, where he did 3 weeks of fasting and meditation. And it said that on the morning of the 21st day, he was struck by a powerful force that descended out of the sky and struck him in the head. And when he kind of revived and he came down the mountain, he had these healing powers. And he was then what I guess what they said differentiated him from other healers. And he lived at a time in 1920s Japan where there was a lot of interest in spiritual healing. There were many therapists performing similar types of healing. But what was said to set Usui apart from his contemporaries was he was also able to impart this power, this ability onto others. And so there is an initiation ceremony, which I'll get to that in a sec, but which Usui performed on his students and was said to kind of help facilitate his students' development of the same abilities that their master had acquired on the mountain. At the same time, just as a bit of an aside, while Usui himself claimed that he did not study this method with anyone, that he didn't learn about it in a book, that he didn't acquire it from anyone, but he acquired it mysteriously through his experience on the mountain, there are a lot of influences on his practice that I and other researchers have discerned, through our investigations. Among them, there are elements that are kind of borrowed or adapted from practices in Japan associated with esoteric Buddhism. So the initiation ceremony is maybe an adaptation of kind of Buddhist initiation, which also had been used in other types of Japanese culture, Japanese spiritual practice as well. That the use for advanced practitioners in Reiki of certain symbols that give different abilities, the ability to heal at a distance, for example, also seem to be adapted from other kind of traditional Japanese practices that are much more ancient than Reiki, which, as I said, kind of started in the 1920s. And there are other aspects, too, which seem to have been borrowed from other therapists of his time. And those therapists were influenced by practices, actually, surprisingly, in some level, that were imported from the US and translated into Japanese. Aspects like affirmation, aspects like the laying on of hands, which was very big in the US at the time, influenced by mesmerism from Europe. So even though on some level Reiki is Japanese, the name is Japanese, there are aspects of Japanese Buddhism that inform Reiki, it also combines those elements with elements that circulated more globally. Mesmerism from Europe, New Thought, right, and the power of consciousness from America, combined with these maybe more indigenous Japanese practices, which of course themselves, thousands of years earlier came from India to China to Japan too. So on the one hand, there is this kind of power of saying this is a Japanese practice. It uses some Japanese words and Japanese characters in the practice, but at the same time, if you trace back its origins from a wide variety of cultures, kind of, you could think of like maybe like the wisdom traditions of various cultures that happened to meet in 1920s Japan in this instantiation, and then has spread from there. And you asked about how did it leave Japan and come to the U.S. The disciple of Usui, one of the disciples of Usui, a man named Hayashi, had a disciple who was a Japanese American woman from Hawaii. Her name was Hawayo Takada, and she is basically the reason Reiki is a worldwide phenomenon today. As I mentioned, in Usui's time, there were many such therapies. There was lots of different kinds of spiritual healing going on in 1920s Japan. The vast majority of them died out around the war. But because she had taken Reiki out of Japan and was practicing within the Japanese American community of Hawaii, and then that she began teaching on the U.S. mainland, most notably in the 1970s, when there was a lot of interest in spiritual development and in kind of therapies of Asian origin. This is the period that made Reiki possible to become this kind of global phenomenon that it has in the last 50 years or so.
Wow. I'm also curious, first, actually, I don't even really know what mesmerism is from Europe. So,
okay.
Yeah, curious about that. And also if you could speak to data that proves, because you'd mentioned that there were a lot of modalities in Japan that died out, and Reiki survived for a variety of reasons. But I imagine that it also survived because it worked, or it was proven to work. And so I'm curious if there is enough data that supports that evidence, or if it's mostly, anecdotal at this point, because I just don't really know, what sort of large studies have been done.
Yeah. Okay. So just real quickly about mesmerism, a lot of times mesmerism today, if you say the word, is associated with hypnotism.
Okay.
And that is one way that mesmerism was used, in the 19th century, was as a kind of suggestion therapy, what we now would call like hypnotherapy. But there was another aspect of mesmerism, which was basically said that all living things have what Mesmer called animal magnetism, and later was sometimes called animal electricity, which is this kind of vital force, and that by manipulating this vital force in different ways, one enacts healing, and that all kinds of healing and disease are based on different fluctuations of this force. And so in America, mesmerists began experimenting with different forms of, this started in Europe, but it was imported to America, and from America to Japan, with different ways of passing the hands over bodies or laying the hands on bodies to affect the concentration, the circulation of this ostensible force. Now, the problem, to transition to your next question about the evidence for its efficacy, the problem is this force has never been able to be measured. There's been a lot of allegations that it correlates with, maybe biophoton emission or with a certain type of quantum resonance. But the jury is really still out on the mechanism behind it, which causes a lot of skepticism, I think, from some medical communities around the force, because its mechanism is not well understood. However, there have been a number of, there's been a lot of research on Reiki, particularly, but on other similar forms of hands-on healing as well. And it does seem to help with a variety of conditions, although there have been also concerns that some of this research has not been properly blinded, for example, that some of the experimental designs have flaws in them. But part of the problem is it's not a pill. It's not something where you could do a double-blind experiment where the person administering the treatment doesn't know if it's a real treatment or not, right? It's just the nature of the treatment is that the person giving it knows that they're doing this thing to help someone else, and that might be part of what makes it work. So, yeah, there has been clinical research. There are a lot of studies that suggest it's helpful for particularly things that, interestingly, biomedicine doesn't have a lot of help for. Things like chronic pain, things like depression and anxiety, things like recovery from, post-operative kind of recovery. PTSD is another really interesting area for research. But at the same time, yeah, it's hard to design randomized clinical trials on things like Reiki the same way you would on a pharmaceutical. So I think within the medical world, you have your believers and you have your skeptics, and both can pick, their studies or their criticisms to support their beliefs. And so it's not really something that the jury is out on one way or another. That said, there are a growing number of hospital programs where Reiki is practiced in biomedical settings, in part because there are hospital administrators and doctors and nurses, particularly, who believe in its power, but also because patients want it and it makes people feel better. So, maybe regardless of whether medical science understands how it works or why it works, like you said, I think that the fact that people feel its power, the fact that people feel that they are healing more rapidly, that they are in less pain, that they are consoled by it, maybe on a kind of psycho-spiritual level. That's the reason why it's become popular and why it's been able to be accepted in these biomedical settings.
I always tell people that I think, trying it and having your own personal experience to determine whether it works for you is always the best step forward, right? So I know that several years ago when I tried Reiki, it was an incredible experience. So,
It's really interesting. I think for some people, their very first time, on a Reiki table, or a friend, puts their hands on their head or something. And some people really just that first time something clicks, they leave their body, they have these kind of, psychedelic experiences, these, what do you call it? When you have a dream that you're totally aware of, kind of like
lucid,
a lucid dreaming. Yeah. Some people really have that very deep experience. A lot of other people just say, "Oh, that was like relaxing. I feel chill." And for some people, it really does take, I think, a lot of experience with it until they get to that deeper place. So it's really interesting. They talk about kind of people having like layers, like an onion, right? And some people can just peel back their layers and get to that core kind of experience very easily. And for some people, there's a lot of unpacking to do. There's a lot of, being able to kind of tune in and tune out, I guess, and, those types of abilities. It's really different, I think, from individual to individual.
Right. Makes absolute sense. Yeah. Justin, can you walk us through the entire process of how practitioners use Reiki to treat the patient? Just maybe you can give us a brief overview, because I imagine the entire process and all the different symbols that exist are probably going to take some time. But if you could maybe just provide a general overview of how it works and how, like, let's say a patient walks in into a Reiki practitioner's office. What's sort of the process that happens next?
Yeah, thanks. So it does differ a bit. There are a number of different lineages of Reiki, and so it does differ a bit from practitioner to practitioner. And also, as you mentioned, the use of symbols and things like that, that not only differs from practitioner to practitioner, but also what level you've reached in your particular lineage. So practitioners at different levels will also maybe have certain techniques that are available to some and not others. But in general, I would say a Reiki session starts off maybe with a little, chat about how you're doing, what's going on in your life, if you're feeling any physical problems, any kind of mental, emotional problems, anything going on with you spiritually. I mean, I think there's usually a little kind of intake chat, not always, but that's often. And then person often lies down. Reiki, I think these days is maybe most often, at least in a professional setting, practiced on a massage table, even though there's not actual manipulation going on of muscles. It's a nice kind of relaxing setting. In a more informal setting, it might be sitting in a chair, lying down on a couch, on the floor, even on a futon or something. But then the practitioner usually does some kind of centering or connecting with the source of the Reiki power. I mean, that's it. Again, it differs from lineage to lineage, maybe even practitioner to practitioner, but there's usually some kind of ritual connection aspect there. And then there's usually a laying on of hands. I mean, that's at least traditionally how it's been done. These days, it seems like more and more people who say they practice Reiki are holding their hands just off of the body and kind of like the aura or an inch or two off the body. But traditionally, and I think in most lineages still today, there is a very light touch, a gentle touch, starting often with the head. Some lineages start with the abdomen, but in usually a series of positions that are maybe associated with different organs. For the head, covering the eyes, having the heads on the temples, having the heads on the back of the skull, treating the throat, treating hands over kind of the heart area, and then the abdomen, like I said, the stomach. And then often people will turn over to the back. Some lineages also treat the shoulders and the elbows and the wrists, the joints, they say can be places of congestion, maybe also, corresponding to the lymphatic system. So there's different lineages that stress different aspects. And also some lineages really stress the practitioner to develop a sensitivity in the hands and to be able to kind of scan the body to find trouble areas. That sometimes someone might have an issue that manifests itself in one part of the body, but on an energetic level, it's said that the cause can be actually distal from there, right? And another kind of in another part of the body. So some lineages, right, want to treat all the major spots in the body in a very systematic way, where others have practitioners develop a kind of intuition and a kind of sensitivity in their hands to find these problem areas, and they may treat longer in those spots. So there's different approaches. And you mentioned symbols. Advanced practitioners will use these sacred symbols that the Reiki community in general does not like to reveal to the uninitiated, but they are said to enhance the power of the practice. They're also said to help heal mental and emotional issues, to help people overcome, bad habits. If you want to stop smoking or stop drinking or, have a healthier relationship with food or things like that, there are Reiki treatments for those things as well. So, and then in the end, usually the person, kind of ends the treatment, does some sort of, closing. There's sometimes a light brushing alongside the spine, although in some localities you need a massage license to do that. So some people don't do that, depending on legality. And then usually a little bit of a debriefing, maybe having a glass of water or a cup of tea, talking about what the person experienced. And often, maybe making arrangements for a follow-up session, because, one treatment is maybe enough to kind of experience it and say, oh, wow, this is something, interesting. But really, particularly to treat chronic issues, an hour or an hour and a half on the table is just kind of, as I said, kind of starting the process. Whereas, to really see results, a lot of times they recommend a minimum of 4 treatments, 4 sessions. And for some chronic issues, it may be, much more than that.
And I'm curious, after a session, patients probably feel a variety of things. Like there could
Yeah.
be detox for some people, there could be
Mm.
relaxation for others. I'm actually curious, what are some interesting stories you've heard about of patients getting treated with Reiki, or even from Reiki practitioners?
Yeah. Mrs. Takata, the woman who brought it to America, has a million such stories, and they're very interesting and at times almost unbelievable. I mean, but I think one thing that she stresses a lot in her stories, and I think you hear it, from practitioners as well, is that there can be. You mentioned detox. There can be these kinds of bringing to the surface things that are kind of deep within. So she talked about, treating a patient who had a boil and it kind of like growing and growing and growing, and then opening up and like all this like stuff coming out, or
Wow.
yeah, it's kind of disgusting, but like but then, or also sometimes patients after treatment might, and this is very common, kind of have like some sort of intense bowel movement where things are being like flushed out from inside them. Is I think one of the reasons why they recommend drinking water and things like that after your treatment, is that there can be these kinds of releases, and so that kind of detox. But other times, those are very obviously very very recognizable kinds of things. But I think on a more subtle level, I think there's often a lot of kind of emotional work that's being done during a treatment, where afterwards sometimes people feel like this like real like feeling of like bliss and like love and acceptance, and are just in this kind of blissed out, like dreamy kind of state. But other times it can bring up maybe some trauma for people. And sometimes people feel like a little bit maybe shaken afterwards. I know that that's also an experience that I've encountered with people with treatments, where just feeling a little like vulnerable and like shaky. And again, like this is part of the process. I think it's like another kind of detox, but maybe like an emotional release. And sometimes people cry. I've had people during sessions cry, that there's these kinds of releases. And yeah, sometimes it happens on a physical level, sometimes it happens on an emotional level. But I think, over time and with practice, and another thing I haven't mentioned yet is that, Reiki practitioners practice on themselves. In part of doing my research on Reiki, I really dedicated myself to trying to have a daily self practice where, even for 5 minutes a day, just laying my hands on myself, whether it's, first thing in the morning or in the afternoon, if I need a little break, or before I go to bed or something, to do a little self treatment is always a good thing. But often, if I have an hour, in my day, this will be, a really great practice, is the kind of daily self treatment. And I think you go through with the self treatment, or if you're getting regular Reiki treatments from someone, you go through these kinds of cycles where something kind of opens up, and then you kind of work on it for a while, and then it resolves, and you kind of feel this new sense of wholeness. And then, over time, there's something else that needs to be worked on too, right? It's never,
Right.
I don't feel like you're never at the end of, it's a healing journey, as they talk about. And I think it's one of the reasons why Mrs. Takata would encourage her patients, her clients, to take Reiki themselves, or to have a family. If someone had chronic illness, maybe to have a family member take the class so they could get regular treatments. Because as you can imagine, right, going to a professional, it might work if you have, you want to get 4 or 5 or even 10 treatments. But if you really are committed to this long path of your healing journey, learning the practice is the best way to to regularly receive treatments. And she often encouraged friends or family members to take the class together, so then they could trade treatments with each other, because the self treatment is really wonderful, but getting a treatment from someone else, it's a very different experience too.
It's interesting. I often tell people that there's no shortcut to the healing journey in the same way that, going to the gym for one day is not going to make you fit. There's a similar philosophy around the emotional world and emotional and spiritual world. So thank you for that. And I'm curious, Justin, what brought you to study these Eastern practices and focus specifically on Reiki?
Yeah. So it's been a lifelong journey. There's a lot of funny twists and turns in it. But from an early age, I was exposed to Asian spiritual practices through my mom, who has been a TM practitioner, transcendental meditation, since I think 1969 or 1970.
Wow.
And so growing up, I was born in 79. So, growing up in the 80s, she, taught me to meditate from an early age. She was encouraging, we were doing kind of like family yoga, back in the mid to late 80s, just at home. We would listen to guided meditation tapes sometimes. And so by the time I was a teenager, these things were in my toolkit, I guess. And I got interested, I think also, through reading the beat literature, like, Kerouac and Ginsberg and Snyder and things like that, in Buddhism, Hermann Hesse. And so when I went to university, I wanted to study Buddhism, and I ended up getting into a program in India to do these different kinds of meditation practices, but also study Buddhism from an academic perspective in Bodh Gaya. And my father, he started reading up the U.S. State Department warnings on traveling to the state of Bihar, where Bodh Gaya is. And he said, you know what, this is not a very safe place, for my only son to travel. How about Japan? There's a Buddhist studies program there as well. And so I ended up, that's changed my life. That set me on my course where I started studying Japanese Buddhism, Japanese religion. I was already practicing a kind of chakra meditation and chakra healing practice at that time. And I became interested in Japanese new religions that were doing healing practices. So I ended up applying for a grant to study energy healing from an academic perspective. And I got that. So I got to travel to India finally. And that's where I actually got my first Reiki initiations, was in India.
Wow.
And then in my master's program, I wanted to compare Reiki with this other practice called Jo-Rei, which, is a more religious practice. Reiki, they say is spiritual but not religious, right? So that people from any tradition can practice it. But it's also, as I was mentioning, kind of a professional practice where people have a professional calling, and make a living being Reiki practitioners. Whereas in Jo-Rei, it's a real religious practice where people don't treat for money, but they encourage people to donate to their temple with their treatment. So I wanted to compare these two and kind of see, the contrast. But my master's thesis advisors were telling me it's too much. You can't. That's not a master's thesis. It's too much. It's too much to do this comparative project. Just focus on one thing. And because not many people had written about Reiki from an academic perspective at that time, I chose to focus on Reiki, and that's been, it's like all these kinds of funny little crossroads. Some people like to say, there is no such thing as coincidence, but there is a lot of kind of contingency where you imagine, what if I had done this other thing with my life? But yeah, here I am, all these years later, and I've committed to this practice as a practitioner, and also to studying it from an academic perspective, understanding its history and how it came to be, and what these communities, what role Reiki has in these individuals' lives and in forming these communities.
Wonderful. Wow. Very, very interesting journey. And you're very lucky that you grew up with such a, I guess, like consciously aware family. So I think you're already set up on a path that's maybe different. So
I guess it's interesting. It's like from one generation to another generation, right? This kind of in spiritual world, they often talk about kind of spiritual evolution or something like that. But it's interesting how, I think some people inherit certain things from their parents. Other people have to, reject things from their parents. But, I think we all do some combination of that, maybe. but that
Right.
there are these kind of intergenerational through lines.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And Justin, has anything changed since COVID-19 has come into the picture? I mean, we're living in unprecedented times this year, and there
Yeah.
is Reiki that can be practiced remotely, I believe. I'm just
Yes.
curious, how is Reiki adapting to the times? And I'm sure my audience is very interested in learning where they can find practitioners, because I
Right.
imagine that they're probably not available in every city.
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty worldwide. I think it's hard to find a country where there are no Reiki masters, but yeah, I think there are places where they're a lot more prevalent than others. And the question of Reiki in the time of COVID is very interesting because as I mentioned, it's a hands-on practice. It's the initiations are done in person and involve the breath as like a kind of way of like imparting the power into the recipient. Which again with concerns about aerosolized viral whatever. I think that
Yeah.
it is a difficult time. I think for this practice because of the physical co-presence aspect. However, as you said, there are distance treatments and some lineages. The big kind of controversy right now, I think, in the Reiki world is about distance initiations and whether Reiki masters who are initiating students at a distance, whether that's something that I think people agree that it works, but people think that maybe it's not ideal, that to actually spend time in the Reiki class, there are energetic phenomena that are happening, outside of the initiation as well, and that that maybe it's not as optimal as taking a class in person. I do know in some places where the curve has been flattened, where people are holding Reiki circles, where people exchange treatments, where people are teaching classes in person. But yeah, I think there is a lot of caution, and rightly so, about being in person, at a time when physical distancing, especially in places where they're trying to get the virus under control. On the other hand, I do know that there are these new types of kind of communal practice where people will send Reiki to all of those who are afflicted with the COVID-19, people who for ecological healing. I know this has been a thing that goes on for a long time as well, kind of sending Reiki to the world, and they'll do it like, let's say 9 p.m. whatever your time zone is, do distance Reiki for this cause for however long. I remember people were doing it for the fires in Australia earlier this year, and that they create what they call like a Reiki wave. So, all the people in one time zone at 9 p.m. are all sending Reiki, and then the next time zone, and then the next time zone. So every hour on the hour, there's kind of Reiki being sent from somewhere in the world toward this cause. So that's kind of also, I think, a fairly recent, I think, particularly in the time of the internet, right? Fairly recent phenomenon in the Reiki world, and using distance Reiki in a kind of innovative way.
Wow. Fascinating. Justin, are there any resources or places where you can point folks to who want to maybe learn more about Reiki or becoming a Reiki practitioner or maybe getting a Reiki session?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many types of Reiki out there, and I really think that different people are drawn to different practices. So it's hard to say, a kind of one size fits all recommendation. I mean, pardon the self promotion, but I have been writing about Reiki, and kind of our growing understanding of it from kind of a historical and cultural perspective. I have a Facebook page, Justin B. Stein Reiki Research, where I've been getting very good responses. But I think mostly from practitioners, that people who are already committed to the practice. For people who are just interested in learning more about it, I'd say really, booking a session with someone, as we were talking about, it might be difficult right now, depending on where you live. that there is a kind of risk involved. I don't know if Reiki practitioners out there are wearing, gloves and wearing masks for practice. I think that's something, you have to take into account for your own risk. But, to get I don't think there's anything really substitutes for getting treatment in person. Although if you are interested in receiving distance Reiki, I'm sure that it's easy to book a distance session as well at this time. I'm sure a lot of Reiki practitioners and masters out there are eager to send distance treatments. So that might be another thing you could try to experience is to book a session where probably you would have a particular time where they're going to start sending the energy to you, and you would lie down and see if, what you experience.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Justin. This was a very fascinating discussion. I feel like I learned a lot, and I also have spent some time practicing Reiki and getting Reiki done. So there's obviously so much more to this space that I think we can find kind of on our own. So thank you for doing the research and dedicating most of your life to this study. So again, for our audience, thanks for joining and for listening. In this episode, we learned about Reiki energy and how it can transform your life. And you can find more information about Justin Stein at justinstein.academia.edu or Justin B. Stein Reiki Research on Facebook. And we'll also include these in the show notes. And please note that nothing stated on this show should be construed as medical or psychological advice of any kind. Please see a medical professional for all medical assessments and treatments. And you can tune in to Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness and spirituality.